Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the last lesson on Edward Fraser's The Last Superstition, a fascinating book that Dr. Robillard and I feel highlights the troublesome journey that many intellectuals nowadays, including Fraser himself, have been on. What dead ends do we end up facing once we accept some of the small mistakes that the modern world is founded on? Sometimes the only way to realize the mistakes is when things get bad enough that those subtle errors become clear. Dr. Robillard left teaching at Oxford, and I was fired from Eton for hostile environments that we both feel are the consequence of some of the errors that this book and the other books on our course outline. So we'll begin with our prayer as normal before we get into looking at how Aristotle's revenge is clearest in biology, ironically, given that that's the exact area that this urge to eliminate final causality that Fraser has explored throughout this book first started in.
Mhm.
Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom. Pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect. Dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method, and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father, forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah.
Now we'll begin with this interesting conundrum because we've seen how one of the big motivations for modern science wasn't actually scientific at all. It was ultimately philosophical. Could you remind us what that motivation was? The project of modern science is ultimately philosophical, not scientific.
So, as we talked about last time with the four causes, final, formal, efficient, and material, that Aristotle argues for and then Aquinas perfects, as we move into the Enlightenment worldview, there is a removal, particularly of final causality and derivatively efficient causality. And that becomes the lens by which the Enlightenment worldview begins and then uh, terminates, or at least takes us to in the present moment with Dennett and the Four Horsemen and whatnot. But this removal or rejection of final causality as we move into the Enlightenment worldview was not something that was robustly argued for. It was just rather assumed, uh, as I was arguing last time. I think it's largely a consequence of the 30 Years' Wars. That people thought, well, uh, strong commitments lead to violence, so we need to we need to avoid reading things and encountering ideas that give people strong commitments, and that's somehow better. That's part of it, and then obviously this assumed rejection of telos is built into the Cartesian framework, into the Copernican framework, into the Lockean framework, and we've essentially inherited that rejection of telos in all the sciences thereafter.
Yeah, Fraser adds a second point to that, which is that once you accept final causality, then you are rationally stuck with God, the soul, and everything that goes with it. And this
Mm-hmm.
places limits on the license that liberalism would like to grant people to make their own meaning and do whatever they choose. Because the whole
Mm-hmm.
point of natural law is that there's a fixed human nature, and some things are rationally good for us and others aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And the attraction of abandoning final causality is that all that goes out of the window and you can decide what your own purpose is, decide what
Mm-hmm.
your own meaning is.
Yes, and then once that is rejected, then in terms of collective political governance, we end up, rather than relying on natural law. Now it's we got to bolt together some version of contractualism ends up being what the Enlightenment mind starts looking towards to order society.
And there's a big problem with that, because if we just have to agree on what human nature is, if we just have to decide by fiat that you're a human, then
Mm-hmm.
it means that the criteria might mean that some people aren't. Phaser points out that, okay, we get to
Mm-hmm.
agree what being a human is, and now we've decided that you're not.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All sorts of errors abound once we enter in. Once that's one of our premises.
And we've also got the strange conclusion, the ironic twist, that without final causality, you can't do science, because the mind goes with it. Now, why is that?
Yes.
Once the mind goes, science goes with it. This world picture has no room for the mind really at all, because according to it, there's just blind matter moving by chance
Mhm.
and necessity, and there's no real intellect and there's no free will.
Yeah. Yeah. It's this is the termination of the entire materialist project in this effort to reduce everything to a material explanation. In that reduction, they end up reducing all of the foundations upon which are necessary to have science at all. And the mind, intentionality, symbols, uh, collective agreement between a scientific community and agents within that community. All of it gets swept right out the door, and so their reductionism ends up resulting in a self-refuting eliminativism of really all foundations.
Could you say a bit more about what you mean by self-refuting? We've got it on our slide here, but let's say I want to claim that I can't speak English, and
Mhm.
I say that to you. I can't speak
Right.
English.
Mhm.
In the act of saying
So
it, it goes against itself,
yeah,
right?
in the act of saying yeah, so that would be an instance of a performative contradiction. So we might have a propositional contradiction where in the actual uh, structure of the argument, there's a claim of A and not A. So that would be self-refuting. But in what you just explained would be like a performative contradiction. Somebody saying, "Yeah, I'm not speaking right now." So it's like, but your very act just betrays the content of the claim.
Right.
And yeah.
And then we've got, as discussed in previous lessons, Nietzsche's claim that there is no truth. And that's also a
Mhm,
self-refuting claim, isn't it? But it's not performative.
mhm. Right, exactly. But for that claim to be true, there would at least need to be one thing that isn't relative, and it's the truth of that particular claim.
Right. So what's the way in which materialism is ultimately self-refuting then? Because Phaser does say that once we get rid of the mind, as the materialist worldview demands that we do, then you can't actually make any arguments for materialism.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. The whole um, motivation, ostensibly, for materialism is it's supposed to be the best explanation of things. And if we say, well, we can explain mind and mental contents and personhood and love and intentionality and qualia and concepts, and we can reduce those to a materialist explanation, that's somehow better than having these inexplicable phantasms that are populated within the world. But as Fisher points out, to understand materialism at all, we need to rely the very things we're trying to reduce are actually undergirding the presuppositions of materialism to begin with, to include, as we said before, sensory data, other agents that can form a scientific consensus. We can do mathematical or logical work to make predictions about these material phenomena.
Mhm.
All that stuff it's foundational to a scientific materialist worldview. So we're reducing the very things that materialism rests upon. And so, in that sense, that's how it's self-refuting.
Right. So we can't make a rational claim for it because it eliminates the very possibility of rationality. And
Mm-hmm.
there are numerous examples of contemporary philosophers, not just philosophers of science, who have been brought around to the classical theistic worldview by the fact that the mind is rational and the world is rational in such a way that the mind can investigate it at all. Now, that's
Mm-hmm.
not the result of science, it's a presupposition of science, and it's a metaphysical one, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. At some point, I think it's this realization that the very act of reduction to materialism is it's relying upon these more foundational categories that are just there, you know, and that they just can't be reduced.
Right. And materialism, rather than trying to explain them, seeks to explain them away or eliminate them
Hmm.
because they
Hmm.
don't fit into
Yes.
its Procrustean bed. So human beings are rational. Oh, but that doesn't fit the paradigm. Therefore, they can't be rational. Human beings have free will. No, they don't. Materialism says they can't.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. So they'll say that, and then they'll often offer some promissory note that, well, the only reason that we haven't shown this conclusively that the reduction hasn't been successful is that we just need to do more science, and that in the future there'll be some, I don't know what, some type of experiment or some set of empirical data that will definitively prove once and for all that we don't have free will or we don't have mental contents. And that is, I mean, it's sophistry at that
Mm.
point. There's absolutely no real argument there.
Yeah, well, it's the last superstition, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the other point is that people need to understand really clearly that given that free will is real, materialism is certainly false. That's why they are so
Mm.
keen to deny it without even having looked at the evidence or considered it. It's just as a point of principle, free will must definitely be an illusion. Otherwise, materialism is done.
Right, right. But then it's like as we've mentioned before, it's like Sam Harris will go on podcasts and talk for hours, but here's all the neuroscience data. But you really don't have free will, and it's an illusion, and it's an appearance, and as sophisticated humans of the 21st century, we need to just get beyond this. It's like a kid growing up and realizing that there isn't Santa Claus. And then the very next day, he'll be on Twitter saying, this person said this thing, and it's a moral outrage, and we
Hmm.
need to collectively decide to do. And it's like, I wonder to the degree to, and Pinker's done the same thing, and all these Dennett as well. I
Yeah,
wonder to what degree
Kanye West has made some bad choices recently.
he's made some bad choices. We need to make better moral choices, come together to attend to this objective evil in the world. So yeah, suddenly the ontological furniture of the world gets brought in and out of existence whenever it's helpful
Yeah,
to these folks,
that's
and
it.
it's you have to, yeah, and you go, oh, wait a second, I see what's going on, but it's that might not be obvious to somebody, some 19-year-old kid, that the first time he's reading The God Delusion or something, like, it could really be a bit, overpowering when you first encounter these types of arguments compared to
Mm,
your someday CCD class.
yeah. So your advice would be look for inconsistency, look for incoherence. If someone's telling
Hmm.
you that there's no purpose to the world, that there's no morality, then watch how they talk and see
Hmm.
if they claim purpose and claim morality.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that can be smuggled in a lot of subtle ways. Like Gad Saad's the parasitic mind, for instance, right? Like he might not objectively say morality, but the term parasitic or thought pathogen, we have these thought pathogens that we need to look out for. It's like, so the normativity, it's very there's a hint of it, like
Mm.
in like flavored soda water or something. It's not hitting you over the head with a thick moral claim, but it's you can hear the normativity in those types of descriptions.
Right. Now, Fraser also mentions John Searle's argument that every form of materialism implicitly denies the existence of the mind, whether or not it intends to. Now, what different kinds of forms of materialism are there? I mean, I can see why ultimately, if you're saying that everything reduces to matter and there's no immaterial component of the human being whatsoever, and the intellect is the immaterial component on the traditional Aristotle's view. In some
Mm-hmm.
sense, that's it. That's mind gone, intellect gone. But different
Mm-hmm.
forms of materialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, you can have your epiphenomenal folks that they'll grant that, okay, fine, there is a material substratum, and there is the phenomenal experience of consciousness and free will and qualia, and that's there, but that it fundamentally, it's just along for the ride. It's not doing anything causally. And then you'll have more aggressive limitist versions like Dennett or the Paul and I forget his wife, Patricia Churchland, that Fraser mentions at the beginning of the chapter, that also attempt to explain, love and higher order conscious states in terms of like C fiber firing, in some neurological correlate kind of way.
Mm.
There's a supervenience relationship between the higher order states and the material substratum, but um, but yeah, and then Dennett's like a full limitivist where he'll say like even intentionality isn't even real. Everything just bottoms out in, I don't know, just meat all the way down, I suppose.
Yeah, so him writing his books on philosophy of mind, it's the process is no different in kind from his liver working or his heart
Mm-hmm.
working.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing else going on there. It's different in degree, perhaps, but not in kind.
Exactly, and I think he's convinced himself that that is the case, and I think he'll just say, "Well, yeah, I'll just bite that bullet. There's really no me there writing this book. It's all just this brute process that's occurring."
There's a few accounts of philosophers who've had experiences of coming close to mental breakdowns over this stuff before they actually came through to the other side. Because what you're really
Mm-hmm.
doing in trying to force the human being into this worldview is
Mm.
ripping out more and more of what is fundamental to being a human in the first place, because it's an
Yes.
attack on the
Yeah.
image of God, which we are made in with intellect and free will. But these are the things
Yes.
that can't fit into the materialistic worldview at all. So there's only so
Yeah.
much you can keep attacking before you get to like the motherboard, as it were. And someone like Dennett,
Right.
maybe it's like
Yeah.
superficiality in that he doesn't really take it seriously. And you've suggested that a
Mm-hmm.
couple of times that they seem to be able to compartmentalize that these are my ideas. And I talk about
Yes.
how I have no mind and no free will and nothing's real when I type on my computer, but then I'll go and live the rest of my
Yes.
life and not take it seriously. Some people
Yes.
do take it seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think there's. I mean, we've talked about Seraphim Rose, whatever his name was before he converted
Yeah.
to Eastern Orthodox, but almost having a mental breakdown, or experimenting with LSD or whatever drugs he was doing to break on through to the other side. Uh, Foucault almost certainly ruined all the categories in his being by his intentional attempts to transgress everything.
Mm.
Um, in terms of philosophy of mind, I'm trying to think. Yeah, who? I mean, there's plenty of mathematicians, Gödel and Cantor, Peano, Post, Russell to an extent, Wittgenstein to an extent, all really. being the inheritors of this hyper rationalist view to the world that rejects any other categories of being.
And ends
Took
by
them
destroying
from
rationality itself as well.
it does, yeah, yeah, and they did not live flourishing lives, I would say, by any account.
Well, you're a smart guy. You're
Probably
very
the
serious as well. You take books and ideas with great integrity. That's plain from listening to you speak for even a couple of minutes. When you were a young man encountering these kind of ideas and hearing them from professors that you probably looked up to, did they
Mhm.
affect you?
Certainly, yeah, yeah. My falling away from Catholicism was almost identical to the way that Phaser explains his falling away when he was in grad school. So if you've never encountered Hume or Nietzsche, Descartes as a in high school or something, and you encounter that in undergrad, it's like the scales are falling from your eyes. This is new. You haven't heard these types of arguments before, and it feels like you're being opened up to the matrix. And then I think it only takes, for me, anyways, it was encountering. So yeah, coming to realization of compartmentalization and hypocrisy in these scholars that I looked up to, deep compartmentalization, hypocrisy in my own life, my own behaviors, and then trans essentially being the the apex of all these errors. Finally, just of modernity, just hitting a dead end and going, uh, this is clearly not right. I need to go back and rethink all the first principles that I chucked out in undergrad. I need to go back and investigate those.
Mm.
And that took me back to a serious a serious and earnest re-investigation of uh, really the five proofs and the argument from contingency in particular.
And the discovery that even the people teaching you didn't present them properly and perhaps didn't even know them properly.
I think it's almost the latter. I would say. I think a lot of the times it's just people just inherit what their undergrad professor taught them and said that, well, this is, these are clearly false. These are clearly just these anachronistic features of the history of thought that people used to believe, in the same way that Thales used to believe that the whole world was made of water. And isn't that interesting and crazy? But we're beyond that now. And as I mentioned this last time, I think the Whig interpretation of history pervades much of academia and much of the Western mind, where it's just this presumption that whatever is that all thought and all discourse, it is inevitably an improvement upon whatever came before it, and that it's impossible for us to ever made any errors individually or collectively. And it's like, well, no, we've clearly made a one or a series of errors where we're at right now,
Right.
and that doesn't become obvious until it does.
No, that's right. And it's useful to see that that's the opposite way of looking at the world from how all the world's traditional religions and mythologies see it, which is that back in the
Mm,
past there was some kind of golden age or Eden that we've now
right.
lost, and ahead
Yes.
there's darkness and things slowly get worse and worse. Whereas modern
Mhm, mhm.
culture has the opposite. Literally, we have this period
Yes.
called the Dark Ages, part of the Enlightenment myth.
Yeah.
The metaphor is there, the light switch is on in the Enlightenment. Now we can see things
Mhm.
clearly, but
Yeah.
things are looking pretty blind now if we look around in modern culture because of their
Yeah.
attitude.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. So I think that had a lot of subtle influence upon my thinking at the time.
Yeah.
I think that also sort of drove me away from, I was thinking of Christianity and religion as just being like proto science that we've transcended and moved past.
Mm. We've mentioned some points related to this already, but Phaser outlines a few popular models of the mind. Maybe it's like a computer running a program, for example.
Mm,
Maybe on
mm,
Dawkins's model, thought is like a meme. And after surveying a few of the hot ones that people often trot out saying, oh, the mind's a computer. Fraser ultimately concludes by saying that the materialist's account goes around in a vicious circle. So all of these
Mhm.
models are incoherent. What does he mean
Yes.
by a vicious circle?
Well, the thing that they are trying to explain, namely consciousness and intentionality in terms of materialism, is then presupposing, or it requires intentionality to get off the ground to begin with. So they're effectively explaining away their foundations. So in particular, the mind is an algorithm, or the mind is, some set of computer symbols. That doesn't fly at all unless you have an intentional mind that can impose meaning upon a bare set of symbols to begin with. And this is something that somebody like John Searle, who isn't religious, has, I think, very successfully fought for years with his Chinese room experiment, or thought experiment. And it just turns out that you need it to presuppose intentionality before you can even have any meaningful notion of symbols chained together in an algorithm that like give rise to consciousness. So that type of that false analogy just doesn't fly at all. But because you have the black box that is a lot of computation these days, and
Mm.
you can have where Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov in a chess match. I think a lot of people, they're like, oh yeah, the computer's alive. It's like, no, it's human intentionality projected into the machine. And it fully reduces to human intentionality.
Yeah.
Um, so
People got
yeah,
very excited when the first pocket calculators were invented, didn't they? They thought that a computer could do maths. But you
yeah,
can obviously get a computer, calculator, whatever, and you can program it with complete nonsense. You can make
mhm,
it inconsistent. And it doesn't understand if you tell it 2 plus 2 equals 5, that that's not the case.
right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's nothing emergent about the if we crank the handle faster and we can just do more computations at a faster speed, that's not going to magically give rise to consciousness or intentionality. That's why you see folks like Ray Kurzweil will, he'll come up with all these graphs and be like, well, like the complexity of, where Moore's law, shows that we're having smaller and smaller microchips being. What the hell is that? That has no bearing at all on a computer suddenly um, achieving intentionality or consciousness just by mere horsepower or mere processing power. But if you use the word complexity, somehow that's the magical word that people will think, oh yeah, the computer's going really fast and can do a lot of these computations. Therefore, it's a mind
Mm.
because of complexity, and that just ends up being a weasel word that doesn't give any real explanatory power to the explanation at all.
Yeah. So an image to convey that point would be that thinking that you can make a computer be able to understand by just making it faster or more complex is like thinking you can take a line and make it thicker by making it longer. It's
Mhm.
just a completely different order.
Yeah, yeah, it's just two different categories
Yeah.
of being. Yeah.
And that reminds me of Aristotle's division of the natural world into inanimate, so like rocks, stones, soil. Then you've got vegetative life. Then you've got animal or sensory life. And then you've got man, the rational animal. And
Mhm.
what we see in terms of the mechanistic model of evolution actually is the same kind of problem, because what are the things they really stumble on? Well, how to get life off the ground in the first place, life from non
Mhm.
life.
Mhm.
And then we're
Yep.
thinking about animal life from plant life, and then human life from animal life. These things aren't
Mhm.
well supported in the fossil record. Now, I'm not saying that
Yep.
there's no way that God could have done things in that way had he chosen to, but the Catholic position aligns with what the Aristotelian metaphysics say, which is that you don't
Mhm.
get intellect from matter that didn't evolve.
Yes, you don't get. Yeah, you don't get new substance just by a pile of a lot of accidents either.
Yeah, right. That's a good way to put it. So, intellect means that any materialistic Darwinian account of the origins of man is certainly false.
Mhm. Yes. Yep. Yeah, you're right. That's the biological analog to the computation idea.
Yeah, I don't hear that
More
talked about very
computational
much.
horsepower. Yeah. 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 I think you're right. But yeah, it's the same structure.
So, intellect, if nothing else is mentioned, intellect alone and the reality of free will mean that any materialistic Darwinian account of human beings is false.
Yes. Yes.
So that brings us on to our next topic, actually, which is that Darwinism was ultimately, according to Fraser,
Mm.
ultimately about trying to complete the mechanistic revolution by eliminating teleology or final causality from biology. I
Mm.
think that's true, but I also find it quite weird that there were people at any point who thought that they could go for a walk in a wood and see something like a snail and think, "Oh wow, that's pretty complicated. Um, I guess the Holy Trinity must be true." So it
Mhm.
seems really strange that the biological argument for God's existence ever formed such a big part in people's minds, because you don't really see that being a big part of the traditional classical theistic arguments for God. So this living creature is so complicated, therefore there's a God. That's not really one of the five ways,
Mhm.
is it?
I guess. I mean, maybe it's. I guess if it were, it'd be some derivative of the fifth way. I guess, right? In a yeah, in a derivative sense. That yeah, there's some type of intelligent order to this small animate thing. Therefore, there's going to be a greater mind that is imparting telos upon it.
Yeah, there's purpose. Although
Mhm.
with the fifth way, Fraser says that even just one electron and one nucleus would suffice.
Right.
So the
Yes. Yeah.
complexity itself isn't the main point.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But nevertheless, it seems to have been the big one. Something like Paley's watchmaker argument, which
Hmm.
never really formed a serious component of the classical theistic arguments for God anyway. That seems
Hmm.
to be the one that Darwinism was really aimed at.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I don't know. I still think things largely get back to this Whig interpretation of history, where we just think that well, whatever we have now is insufficient, and we need to swap it out with a new explanation. And this whatever we had before couldn't suffice. So what's the new game in town? Well, it's I don't know, Darwinian natural selection. Let's that constitutes advancement.
Mm.
Why? Because it's new. I think that's a big part of it.
And the attraction is that it helps them get rid of final causality anyway, ultimately.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Okay,
It completes it. Yeah.
all right. So it's metaphysically motivated more than scientifically. And
Mhm.
we made the point a few sessions ago, actually, that if you take the view that things have no real nature, no essence, then as Darwin himself acknowledged, then even the idea of species is threatened. It
Mhm.
falls apart, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. Yeah. You just end up with just piles of accidents that don't. There's no metaphysical principle that's going to give rise to a new kind. So even never mind any theistic implications. Just Darwinism on its own, by its own lights, seems to not give us what it's promising.
Mm. That's the universal acid point again, isn't it?
Yeah. Yep.
applied even to species. So we've
Mm.
got final causality. We've also got this idea of the complexity of biological systems, which is the intelligent design argument that some theistic thinkers make. But that one opens itself up to the God of the gaps objection,
Mm.
which
Mm.
Aquinas's kind of arguments aren't susceptible to because they're more in the nature of
Right.
metaphysical demonstrations similar to a geometrical proof. They're not probabilistic.
Mm. Mm. Yes.
But in people's minds, though, the appeal of Darwinism is that it helps them to dismiss some of the Paley style probabilistic arguments by saying, no, look, I guess it could have come about this way by natural selection acting
Mm.
slowly over time.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I think if one's strictly within a particular inductive framework that has already chucked out telos, then and now you're competing between Paley or Darwin, then yeah, Darwin's probably going to be more explanatorily satisfying.
Right. And yet they seem to have real trouble doing without final causality. And Fraser says that one of the places they relocate teleology while pretending it doesn't exist is DNA. So this whole thing becomes a kind of shell
Mm.
game.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
This is your smuggling in point,
Yeah, we so yeah we actually haven't gotten rid of, yeah, it's Aristotle's revenge as well. Yeah, we haven't got rid of telos. We've just relocated it in a very micro, fine grained way back into memes intending to do something, or back in DNA having sort of quasi intentionality.
who's that guy who's put down a lot of money for a big prize related to DNA and the encoding of information? You heard of that? Let me try and
No.
find who it is. There's an enormous amount of prize money. He's basically thrown down the gauntlet to the scientific world and said, "Look, if
Mhm.
you can find me an example of this, uh, all this money is yours." Let me try and find his name quickly. It just popped into my mind because it
Mhm.
shows what a big challenge this actually is, trying to account for DNA without any kind of teleology.
Mm.
Yeah, Marshall. Marshall's his name. $10
Mhm.
million prize for anyone who can demonstrate a naturally occurring encoding or decoding system. The system
Mhm.
cannot be pre programmed with any kind of code. And the prize has got judges that include the top physiologist at Oxford, Dennis Noble. He was the first person to make a computer model of a human organ, the heart, and his discoveries made the pacemaker possible.
Mhm.
And he says that what this challenge is really about is that biology has always posed a problem for the mechanistic approach to science,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
biologists have always continued to think in terms of purposes. Hearts are for pumping blood, eyes are for seeing, immune systems are for maintaining the health of the organism. So,
Mhm.
in each case, we've got what something is actually for, what it does. And he said that the single cell produces a wider variety of items than all of human manufacturing, at least until pretty recently. So, $10 million prize, and people are still stumped by it, how you can get a naturally encoding system.
Mm. Yeah, you would think Dent and Dawkins and the Churchlands and company would be scooping up this money super fast, right? Should be easy for them, you
Right.
know.
And
Uh,
it's not. And this again is like we
yeah.
saw with philosophy of mind as well. If something doesn't fit the mechanistic model, then just sweeping it under the rug of the mind. Uh, these are things that, in principle, can't be explained on that model.
Mhm.
So that $10 million prize money is going to be sitting there happily. It's safe.
Yeah. Yep. The I also liked, related to this, that Phaser brings up at the very end, talking about the finger pointing to the moon, how Aquinas notes that telos is, it's the most fundamental of the four causes, and it brings along and implies all the other ones. So once you remove telos, it diminishes and impacts all of your other accounts of causality as well, from material to formal to efficient. Those all get jumbled in the process as
Right.
well.
So this is the idea that it's the cause of causes. Now,
Yes. Yeah.
what is the reason for that? Why is final causality the most fundamental of all the causes? Because you do see that, of course, if this is the one you're trying to eliminate, then
Mhm.
things are going to go haywire because of it. Your ability to talk about reality coherently is going to be
Yep.
ultimately destroyed, which is why they can't talk about it without presupposing final causality at all.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And then smuggling it back in elsewhere. Um, yeah. I'm just going to read just what he says here,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I
yeah.
think it is the best way to do it. Uh, Aquinas notes that final causality is the cause of causes, the most fundamental of the four causes. The reason should be clear for what we've seen in this chapter. Nothing can even be made sense of as an efficient cause as that which brings something else into being, unless it is at the same time possessing goal directedness or finality. Moreover, for it to be directed towards a certain end entails it having a form or essence appropriate to the realization of that end, and thus a material structure capable of instantiating that form or essence. A hammer, for instance, if it is to fulfill its function, must have a particular structure and be made of some material capable of maintaining that structure. So yeah, you lose final causality, and it, all all the other causes get diminished or disaggregated.
Yeah. So, in terms of efficient causality or the formal cause, or now, what is the thing? By what process does it become what it is? What is the matter, the material cause? All this only makes sense in the light of ultimately what its end,
Mm-hmm.
its purpose
Mm-hmm.
is.
Yeah. Yep.
So it's a of all the things to try to take out of your worldview, it's the most ridiculous one.
It's the most ridiculous one, and as we see in all these examples, it just gets smuggled back in anyhow. So it never really gets removed fully. If they're going to have any coherent account of DNA or computer processing or scientific explanation, yeah, it just gets relocated in these more subtle ways.
Right. And that's a clue to anyone thinking about this carefully about what an important fundamental aspect of reality it is, that even the people who
Mhm.
are hell bent on trying to do without it can't.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
We've got an interesting question. Seeing as we're getting close to the end of this book, what connections are there between Havel's post totalitarianism and the eliminative materialism slash mechanistic science slash new atheism described by Phaser? I can think of one or two. What are your thoughts on this?
Um, I remember we made this connection when we opened up the book.
Yeah,
I would say, I mean, one is if your account of a human person is shorn of telos and shorn of goal directedness, either individually or towards collective human flourishing, then you're left essentially with this automaton that ends up finding its identity only in relation to this machine. So the mechanistic worry that we see in the Enlightenment that's overtaken the Aristotomist view in political form becomes the totalitarian state, and reduces the person to a cog in a machine. Um, I think there's some analogy there. I'm not sure how
Mm.
tight it is, but that's the best I can come up with.
I think one of the things that's significant here is Havel's account of how totalitarianism thrives in a world where objective meaning, value, and purpose have all been stripped away. His
Mm-hmm.
his 4 points about how the post-totalitarian system, distinct from the classical dictatorship, has been built on foundations laid by the historical encounter between dictatorship and consumer society. Now, why is consumer society an important factor there? He pointed to four reasons. It's very consumption orientated, and that partly is because people are looking to fill the void of meaning and purpose with
Mm-hmm.
distracting purchases. We've got trivializing temptations. So if we get rid of natural law and the idea that human beings have a a final cause, have something that's objectively good for them to realize about themselves, then what's going to take the place of that? Then Havel points to mass indifference. So nothing really means anything. And then
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, I think the most important one is the grayness and the emptiness of life. Because if you remove the Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics from the account of the philosophical anthropology of the human person, then that grayness and emptiness is exactly what you are left with. We made this point a
Mm-hmm.
couple of times, didn't we, about there being nothing that's really good for us. You can't even have truth. There's no objective morality. You can't even do science. I mean, how grey do you
Right.
want to get?
Yeah. Yeah. It renders a person, you're just an amoeba at that point, trying to move from the cold side of the petri dish to the warm side of it. It's just pleasure and pain stimulus. That there's no other good uh, at that point.
And Havel's point is that people aren't made for this. Human beings crave for
Mm.
more. And that's
Mm.
where ideology steps in and provides a kind of surrogate religion, which
Mm.
is what
Yeah.
Fraser's whole point about the last superstition is. Because what we're looking at here isn't any set of scientific results or claims that came along and proved Aristotle and Aquinas wrong. It's
Mhm.
just a competing set of metaphysical claims that didn't even compete fairly in the first place. They just said,
Mhm.
you guys aren't allowed to play.
Yep.
We've rigged the game such that we're the only game in town.
Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. They're not even allowed on the board to begin with.
That's it.
Yep.
So, final causality then, fundamental.
Mm.
And Fraser says that Aristotle's revenge is also Aquinas's revenge. And this is the reason why modern secular intellectuals can't admit it, because he says that their project is ultimately the same as the early modern project. Now, what is that project ultimately? Are we coming back to that cosmic authority problem that Nagel mentioned a couple of lessons ago? Is that part of it?
Mm.
Is it pride, that Whig interpretation of history that you've mentioned? What is the
Mhm.
modern project? Pregnant men? Mastery of nature?
Right.
Bacon's
Yeah.
enlightenment? We can become like gods? Is it going to be transhumanism and AI next with implants from Musk?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's all these things. Just a a doubling down on error almost as well. Where it's like, well, this is the direction of travel that we're in, so we can't reverse it. We're clearly heading to some sort of benevolent future, and I think it's about time we listen to C.S. Lewis and consider our our understanding of progress might mean reversing course.
Seems that way, doesn't it? The way things are going, though, in academia, I'm reminded of the line when Macbeth thinks about repenting and he just says, "I am in blood, stepped in so far that returning were as tedious as go." He thinks, why not just keep walking? I think there's a real
Mm.
sense from some of these people that they're not turning back.
They're not turning back, or the point that you've made, I think, very well in the past, is that they think that if they stay silent and complicit, then somehow their life's going to go well, and that they don't need to be the one that steps out or sticks their neck out. Someone else will do it for them. And as we've seen in other nasty historical epochs and regimes, that tends to almost never be the case. You know, you just they just come for you later. So the people that remain silent, complicit, they're not going to have a happy ending either.
Yep. So, if nothing else, then continuing on the current path and eventual collapse, there's historical precedent for that in the Soviet Union, for example. We know that happens
Mm.
eventually, even if it's decades and decades away. But
Yep.
the very fact that there are books like this at all, and we're having conversations like this, show that despite the darkness, some people are still getting the signs of the light, which is a reason for
Yep.
hope. And you talked about the finger pointing at the moon a moment ago. Phaser
Yep.
says that the material world points beyond itself to God. This is St. Augustine's idea about the book of nature that we just have to
Mm.
learn to read from. And that comes back to Aquinas's point about the empirical data and the rational premises working in a pincer movement. So we combine the
Mm.
best of both. We can
Yes.
have available to us all the kind of empirical things that the materialist wants to avail himself of. It's just that we're not
Mm.
going to strip them of their power by talking in this philosophically incoherent way about removing all final causality.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, otherwise, yeah, we end up at pregnant men or
Yeah.
whatever's beyond that. And yeah, so at some point, these folks they're just going to have too many bullets that they're going to have to bite, and have to realize that maybe there's a significant error that they've been making. Hopefully.
This is Pascal's point that there's light enough for those who want to see, and darkness enough for those who would prefer to delude themselves.
Mm.
The secularist sees only the material world. There's a kind of willing blindness in that, I think. So,
Mm.
thinking
Yeah.
back then over what we've picked out as most important across this, let's just do a recap of some of the points across the book that we think are most important. And if you've got any thoughts about how this relates to your own intellectual journey, I'd love to hear them.
Mm.
I'm sure other people would as well. So, things that I didn't know, certainly, when I was in my early 20s, first reading this book. Religion upholds reason. What? I thought the two were
Right.
opposite. I thought
Mhm.
reason was
Mhm.
the thing that fights against religion, which is just blind faith and is irrational.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, that's the whole Enlightenment narrative out of the Dark Ages point that you had mentioned. Yeah.
So, in fact, what we've learned from Phaser's book is that only the classical theistic worldview can make sense of human rationality at all.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah. I liked his quoting of Aquinas's reason as a preamble to faith. I think that was well said, and I wish somebody had framed it like that to me 20 years ago, as opposed to seeing it or framing it as the two mortal enemies that can't coexist.
Right. So, you don't shut your eyes and believe without rational reasons, without rational ground for it. There are philosophical, rational arguments for God. And then because of those, you then have rational grounds for trusting revelation in addition to
Mhm.
what you can discover by purely natural reason alone. So the whole
Yeah.
thing is based on reason. Or
Mhm.
you can throw your lot in with Darwin, Dennett, and the others who end up denying rationality and the existence of the mind at all.
Mhm. And then smuggling back in these things whenever they need them. Yeah.
Right. Anyone who thinks he can escape from final causality ends up finding out that he can't, and it comes through in
Mhm.
his language and also in the presumption that you can even do science whatsoever.
Mhm.
Um, we also have this dream of escaping from metaphysics, but that's not the product of any kind of scientific investigation. It's a
Mhm.
pre scientific philosophical claim, and it's is itself metaphysics.
Mhm. Yeah. Yep.
And a
Yeah.
big one for
That's
you too, the uncaused cause. This is what you discovered when you were, on the one hand, troubled by the trans phenomenon, and the other hand, doing your
yep.
research into the terrorist mindset and
Yeah.
what kind of intellectual background they might have stemmed from, and looking at Avicenna
Yep.
and some of the Muslim
Yep.
philosophers, you realize that the whole point is that it's not cause. This is necessary, unmoved mover.
Exactly. Yeah. The so I have the quote here on 108. What would this first cause be like? Note first that a pure being or existence, he would also be pure actuality, and thus everything said about the unmoved mover would be true of him. Indeed, it is obvious that the first cause and the unmoved mover are identical. Hence, equally obvious, the first cause is God. So, yeah, the version of that argument from Aquinas or Aristotle that I received in my undergrad was not that argument. It wasn't God as a necessary being. It was God as big contingent being. Ha ha. That's like believing in a flying spaghetti monster or in
The Sky
Thor or in
Daddy.
Zeus or whatever, or a big sky daddy, right? So it's like that quickly gets knocked away,
Yep.
and now your your whole worldview just crumbles in maybe a weekend,
Yeah.
and like that's what happened to me. And then you spend 20 years of your life trying to repair it. So anybody listening, just get the book and go to page 108. I'll save you 20 years of hardship. Just do that instead. Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
then we've got Phaser pointing out that if nothing is contrary to natural law, then basically anything goes. So this idea that there is a human nature
Mhm.
and there are things that are objectively good for us, including
Mhm.
the pursuit of truth. Otherwise, you're stuck with Nietzsche's question: well, why truth at all? Why is murder wrong? Why is
Mhm.
paedophilia wrong? There's no
Yep.
objective morality whatsoever. We've covered the
Mhm.
faith is founded on reason point again, but I think it bears re-emphasis that this is rational all the way through, including up to the level of revelation, which we have rational reasons to trust.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
Aquinas and Aristotle, certainly up there, probably the two greatest human intellects. These guys weren't defeated in philosophical argument. They were just told they couldn't come and play. The game was rigged because the conclusions were what were desired, not really the arguments themselves were convincing. It's just that they had a conclusion in mind they wanted to reach.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly.
Uh,
The
yeah.
uh, So I was going to say that as far as positive things that brought me back to the faith was seriously re-engaging the argument from contingency or the idea of a necessary being, realizing all of these complications that Phaser points out in chapter 5 of the modernist view, whether it's mind body problem, fact value distinction, how we account for empiricism at all, other minds, all of these, the Enlightenment was supposed to solve a lot of the problems of the past, but it splinters into all sorts of
Mm.
uh, even more difficult problems. So, and then I think it bottlenecks with something like trans becomes the ultimate expression of small errors building up.
Yeah.
Um,
A lot of these problems just aren't problems for the Aristotomist view, like
yes,
the
exactly.
is ought distinction. Well, values
Mhm,
built
mhm.
into fact in some sense because
Yeah.
given what human nature is, there are things that are good for it objectively.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the Enlightenment creates problems that just never existed beforehand.
Correct. Yep.
That's
Yep.
the smuggling back in that you bringing up again and
Yes.
again. I think.
Yes.
So we're left now with getting back to first principles, which is part of what we're trying to do with this series, really. And I think
Mhm.
it's worth pointing out that Fraser expresses great gratitude in the preface to The Last Superstition, saying that our civilization is so great that even in its depressing decadence, he was still able to find his way running the gamut or running the gauntlet of the degeneracy of modern philosophy to find the Aristotle's classical theistic worldview in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. The true, the good, and the beautiful always have a way of shining through, and I think that's something we can all take confidence in.
Right, exactly. The question to finish: what can be done about these prevalent ideas that religion and reason are at odds and that religious truth must be scientifically explained? Well, what we're trying to do here with this podcast is one thing. Guys like Fraser writing books like The Last Superstition or another. We need to
Mm.
get people in mainstream education presenting these arguments honestly and rigorously in a way that's historically informed. Is
Mhm,
that
mhm.
likely to happen? I'm not sure. What do you think, Dr. Robillard?
In bits and pockets, I think I think that's what it's going to look like in all the institutions, right? Is you're going to have little holdouts here and there that are reviving or protecting these traditions and these ideas, and other places not so much. I think more philosophically informed science would be really helpful. You got knuckleheads like Neil deGrasse Tyson saying, "Stay away from philosophy." There's no reason to for one to entertain philosophy, and it's so I think that type of scientism and its figureheads needs to be challenged, and
Mm.
I see what we're doing to be a part of that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The difference between science and scientism is absolutely crucial. And people need to inform themselves about the history of metaphysics so that they're making
Mhm.
smart choices rather than being bowled over by something that sounds impressive but really is incoherent.
Yeah, yeah, and I think also your point too is like observe what these people are saying in different domains, and are they being consistent, and then are they being consistent with how they perform and act in their own life, and if there's radical disconnection between these things, then it's good reason not to trust them as a font of knowledge.
Yeah, right. And the other thing I find amusing is if you ask them um, about sexual morality as well, what you'll normally find, Fraser points this out in the preface as well, is that one of the real justifications for this otherwise absurd worldview is that the motivations are largely sexual. It's about free love in some sense. So,
You start seeing that, especially with the transhumanist crowd. The like it's no surprise that they're all some version of consequentialist, or there's some version of hedonistic account of utilitarianism too. It's like, oh, well, I wonder why that is.
yeah,
And I think it gets to that point. Yeah.
yeah. Sometimes I feel like just telling people, look, stop talking, just cut to the point where you're going to try and rationalize fornication.
Right.
I know
Yeah.
that's where you're
Yeah.
heading. Just go and hurry up and get there. Hurry up and get there so I can just tell you you're wrong. That's all it is.
Yeah.
All right, this has been fun. So we're having a break next week, and then
Mhm.
we will be back with books 8 and 9 of Plato's Republic.
Nice. Looking forward to it.
All right, it's been a pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Same here,
Take
as
care.
always.
Bye.
Later. Bye, everyone.